I have a lot of
Hello, my name's Carrie, Barbara and Marlene. We run a native plant roadside stand right up the street. It's on Hollywood Road, about a half mile north of McKay's. And the goal of having this roadside stand is to sell seasonal native plants at a cost-effective price. Basically, usually we stick with plugs because you can buy a lot for your money. And if they're planted at the right time, that's where it's mostly a seasonal stand. We sell most of our product in April, early May, and in the fall. I would say mid-September, October. And if you plant with plugs, even quartz would be for more of your plants that it's nice to have a little head start, things that may grow slower, you know, maybe Baptisia and some of the grasses. And we are just starting with shrubs in gallons this year. And we have an on-site demo garden. The goal of the demo garden is to show you what they look like and kind of give you some ideas. Okay. And all these pictures were taken at Butterfly Alley last year in our demo garden. Really following on what Karen said, we try and have a lot of host plants, and if you plant them, they will come. So what do we have? We have spice bush. This is our spice bush caterpillar. After it leaves the spice bush and heads out to make a chrysalis in the woods, it turns vibrant orange. Of course, we have monarchs, and we have like 4 different kinds of milkweed in the garden: common milkweed, swamp milkweed, butterfly weed. And so we get a lot of monarch caterpillars, and that's your tiger swallowtail Karen mentioned. They love to feed on joe pie. We have a few varieties of joe pie. And this is your black swallowtail caterpillar. Generally, you'll see them in your home vegetable garden on your parsley, but this is on Zizia aurelia, which is a native local host plant for the black swallowtail. So Barbara's going to speak about some gardening ideas and practical considerations.
And it really doesn't even take very long or very much before you start seeing all that diversity, all the new layers of insects and birds that you never even noticed before. So it really doesn't even take very long to even start to do all that. So, so here's just some practical considerations. You know, if you want to get plants, you can buy a fuller grown plant from a nursery or someplace like Chesapeake Natives. But you can also go for plugs, which are going to be much smaller, but maybe take a little longer to grow, but sometimes much more economical. Divide plants from a neighbor, and even grow your own seeds. They'll be planted, it'll be a little bit quicker to plant, a lot easier to plant. Then if the general recommendation is to plant pretty densely. So that sometimes pretty much boils down to 1 plant per square foot, because instead of that kind of tradition of 1 full-grown plant, a lot of mulch, and another plant, the idea is to let them all kind of grow together to make a sort of an ecosystem. Eventually they'll be filling in with maybe other smaller plants, even things we might call weeds, that will fill it in and help create those layers that have been talked about. So if you're planting, say, a 3-foot by 10-foot strip, you might need 30 plants. So sometimes starting small is better. It takes a little while. You might have to have mulch for a while in between, but you can sometimes get that planting started a lot sooner. Another thing that I personally think is a good place to start is to kind of limit the number of species. Eventually, of course, the goal would be nice to have your half acre all planted with a whole new environment and every single thing that you can find and all those native plants that Karen showed in her volume. But to start out, that's not really possible, especially if it's a yard, in your front yard. So by having just a couple of types of plants, a couple of species, you can concentrate on having more of a food source. For example, one half could be something that supports a caterpillar. The other plant could be something that's a really good pollinator, a really good flower source for pollinators. So you can kind of mix and match their ecological role without trying to have one of this and one of that and one of that. Can sometimes make the planting look a little more deliberate. And the plants, you could plant in drifts and masses, and the plants themselves will sometimes tell you how they like to grow. Some plants grow as clumpers, like a grass or something, and some plants kind of like to weave themselves in and out. Then, like anybody that does gardening knows, you have to have the right plant, the right place, you know, on the environmental level. You're not trying to put in a lot of fertilizer, change the ground, so you want to work with the soil that's already there, the sun that's already there, and the water is particularly important. All new plants need water their first year, and so you have to drag a hose. If you can't drag a hose there, then maybe that's not the best place to put your garden at the beginning, because carrying water is heavy. I know, because I've made that mistake of saying, oh great, I'll put my plants there, but the hose doesn't reach. So you either have to buy a lot more hose or carry a lot of water. So here's some plants, example plants that work well in a shady area. The golden ragwort, Pachyra aurea, Tiarella cordifolia, heartleaf foamflower, which is the white, and Phlox stolonifera, creeping phlox. They all bloom kind of early in the spring, so they're really good for those early bees that are coming out of the ground, need pollen and need some nectar. And they see how nice they look, just a one row of one thing, one row of something else. This is Veronicastrum virginicum, which is a Culver's root. That's that tall white one. Echinacea, the regular coneflower, the purple coneflower, and pale purple coneflower. And Eutrochium dubium, which is the Joe Pye weed, which was mentioned as being a really good host plant for, I guess it was the swallowtail. And you can see that this is a nice example of a kind of a contrast of textures and sizes and forms. So you don't need anything really fancy, but by kind of looking at the total structure, it doesn't look like just a bunch of plants that you put there that are not as neat and tidy as some of your regular garden plants. So here's some more that grow nicely in the sun. This is Agastache funiculum and Euringium yuccifolium, which is called rattlesnake master. And you can see they're planted in drifts, and the really striking contrast of form and shape. And just, again, two plants, both are really good for pollinating, and the hyssop blooms all summer, and lots of bees and butterflies. So again, simple is sometimes best. Here's some more for sun. The classic butterfly milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa, the evening primrose, the penstemon, which is the white one, and this grass is Chasmathium latifolium, what they call it river oats, which right now you can see is nice and small and green as this beautiful contrast to just this mixture of simple colors. But these will eventually, of course, fruit and have very interesting long seed pods, grass, that can be really, really nice looking. And these all grow in sort of, they need some moisture, but they can also grow in a drier place too. Some of them can handle a little more shade. And by the way, almost all these pictures are from local gardens. I think this one is from, I think this one is someone who's here, herb yard. So, you know, these are plants that really, really, really grow in southern Maryland, right here, 2 miles away or 3 miles away. So there's something that you don't have to just look at the pretty pictures and say, I wish I could grow that. You actually probably can. And then this is scarlet bee balm. And I think that was eutrochium, right? Yeah, it's got the bone set. This is a pretty common plant around here, big pollinator, keystone plant. This is attractive to butterflies and hummingbirds. And you can see here, there's just like 2 groups, like a red and a white, just a mass of both that can, you know, just look really nice and neat and tidy, and they both serve their different function. And sometimes, again, planting these just 2 groups, you can have one, you could have them both flower at the same time. You could have one that flowers at different times, and the other one will be short, and the other one will grow taller.
So you can kind of mix and match depending on what it is that you're thinking of trying to do in a fairly small area, like I say, 10 by 30 strip. They could be in 2 parallel lines or sort of mixed together, depending on how each one is growing. And if you wanted to add a little bit more, let's say you had 2 flowers that bloomed about the same time, and you didn't want it to be without anything else during the rest of the year, you could put a grass behind it that will start to change color in the fall and give a contrast to the plants. Even if they're not blooming, they'll still have sort of a combination of textures. So then here's the classic goldenrod and spotted bee balm, Monarda punctata, both blooming more late in the fall. And after that is the Sylphiotrichum obligifolium, which is aromatic aster. And the aster and goldenrod is the best place to start with everything. They will bloom in the fall, they look great together. Both of them are important keystone plants that support a lot of caterpillars and pollinators. And I think that, you know, you can't fail with that. Even if you don't do anything else, put a bunch of asters and a bunch of goldenrods in your yard. There's an aster for every condition, there's a goldenrod for every condition as far as sun and moisture and size. Some of them can get a little bigger, some of them can get a little, you know, some of them grow smaller, some of them grow pretty big. But each one, that's to me one of the best company.
I missed the plant in between. What was before,
Oh.
but after goldenrod?
The little guy in between, this guy here,
Yeah.
that's called Monarda punctata. What do they have? We have our regular name here, spotted bee balm. Even though it's sometimes hard to remember those names, it really is nice to try and remember the actual botanical name. And that was also kind of a little more fun. I know Karen talked a little bit about genus as far as specialist bees, what caterpillars eat. And by knowing and looking at it through the botanical name, you can sometimes see which plants are related to what other plants. It gives you a little bit of idea of how they might grow. When you research it and you're looking at it through the botanical name, the websites that come up are often ones that have a little more information about how a plant grows where it's normally found, and gives you an idea, will it spread a lot, what kind of flowers it might have. So I think it's a lot more fun. It gives you a little more of a kind of a botanical concept, botanical idea. So Karen, of course, mentioned everybody's going to talk about not cutting down the plants in fall, leaving them off all winter. So you have winter interest. So the plant has to look good during the winter. And if it's in your front yard and you have a patch of brown weeds that your neighbors say, why did you cut down all these plants? winter is supposed to be flat, mulch, and nothing else. You kind of have to plan with that idea in mind, that it's going to look a little different. You leave these weeds standing up all winter. So again, if you have them kind of in a groove with sort of an idea of what they might look like during the winter, it'll give you a little bit more of a planned look to keep them standing. And the classic winter interest points are seed pods, interesting flower heads that leave. The echinacea has that round seed head that's left. The birds will sometimes eat the seeds, but even if it doesn't, they look kind of like little lollipops along. Some of the plants have a very structural look when they dry. Goldenrod has very interesting color. The leaves stay on for most of the winter, even though they're brown. So you can use that as a way to kind of plan some of your look to not be completely abandoned looking. And also, by having the plants grouped together, if it is a caterpillar that is wintering in the leaves of that certain particular species, there'll be plenty dense, plenty there for that insect to be able to make use of what it's needing. So, Karen mentioned Tacoma bark looking nice, and the small shrubs, and having a more formal look. So there's been a lot of people that have been looking at that. This is from Mount Cuba, which is in Delaware, right? And yeah, thanks. Delaware, it's a big botanical garden, and everywhere they're doing a lot of research on native plants, on which plants attract most insects. They also develop a lot of what are called cultivars, which are breeding plants to have certain characteristics. The characteristics that are the most successful to use are plants that have been bred to be perhaps more small and compact. And those also lend themselves quite a bit to a more formal look, because you could have just a regular traditional perennial border of a mounding plant. And some of the small shrubs that have been mentioned are some of the asters, the Symphyotrichum obligifolium, which is an aromatic aster, and there's a cultivar called October Skies, which asters can grow this tall, and you've seen them probably in your yard, the volunteers. They can be very big and bushy. The October Skies was bred to remain more small, more mounding. The Baptisia that Carrie mentioned is a slower growing plant. Legume family supports lots and lots of caterpillars, but it takes a while for it to grow, but it will remain mounding. And then smaller shrubs also, of course, lend themselves to this look, like the sweet pepper bush, Lindera benzoin, which is the spice bush for the spice bush caterpillar that we had a nice picture of. One called St. John's wort, which remains quite small and bushy with yellow flowers that really get covered with bees and small flies and insects in the early summer. And it seems to bloom a while, but it kind of comes out early summer, which is sometimes sort of a hard time for pollinators because it's a transition period between all the flowering trees and shrubs that we have here, like redbud, and before some of the perennials have really started to go. So that's a nice one to have. I like that one a lot. A New Jersey tea is another one that has white flowers that also grows pretty small. So one of the things that's often mentioned, again, I'm kind of thinking about your backyard party. They talk about, some people have been talking about mullet natural gardening, business in the front, party in the back. You let it go wild in the back, but in the front, your neighbors might look at it, and so you might want to have it. It also might be much more small an area because there might be an area along the drive, along the front of the house. So One of the things that's constantly mentioned, and I think this was developed by a lady during the 90s, she calls it cues to care. It means it doesn't look like an abandoned yard you forgot to mow. And that one of those things, the most common things, it's true with any garden, would be paths, benches, nice outlined beds. This is Butterfly Alley, so it's right around here, and you can see, even though all the plants in the demonstration garden were planted there to grow as regular plants, not with any kind of aesthetic overlook, they still have that much more tame looking because they're surrounded by a path, they have the bench. So that is, one of the more common things, even if you don't sit in the bench, having it there. And then one hopes, though, that as things get going and you get to start seeing some of these plants, knowing them, people will go and sit in that bench. This is one, it just shows the simplicity of a clean, mowed edge. I mean, everyone here in Southern Maryland has a stupid front yard that's just open, flat grass, and you sit on your riding lawnmower and mow it all every 2 or 3 weeks. And it's like, why can't we just do this instead? You could still mow your lawn, it has a nice clean edge, but see, it's just 2 messes of plants. Some tall ones and some short ones. They're not even all in bloom. But because of that really, really sharp edge, it's a real impact. And there's plenty enough plants in there to support the variety of insects and many other things. I mean, frogs could live there, turtles could live there without even really trying too hard. That's one of the ones, I like that one a lot. You could put a water source, a sculpture. Several organizations will make signs that you can put saying natural, this is a pollinator garden. And of course, Maryland has made a big advance with the recent passage, I think it was in last October, by the state legislature that has made it so HOAs cannot force someone to remove a verified native plant garden. So having a sign there is another way of making sure that that is recognized as such and wouldn't give anyone a problem about that. Rudbeckia hirta, black-eyed Susan, and I'm not sure what the white one is. And here's almost the same thing, but this one is an example of sometimes design just happens. This happens to be my yard. I actually planted on purpose the black-eyed Susan, which is all this. And then this is Enothera biennis, which I think was, this back here, which is the common even primrose. You'll see it all over. And it grows really, really tall. You can trim it and it will actually stay shorter. Now I let mine grow tall in my backyard. It grew up to 8 feet tall and it's like a stalk. It was a forest. But right now you can see it just looks really cool. It's just this nice straight look here. And this is what Erigeron. Anyways, again, I had to learn how to say that the right way because I was calling it Aragon. It's what they call annual flea bane. It grows everywhere, and it grows in the beginning part of the summer, but it lasts through the whole summer. Just popped up, gave this beautiful little airy look to everything. And I didn't try, it just volunteered completely. And then this is what they call, Conisa canadensis. Canadian horseweed, which again grows like 8 feet tall and is considered a weed, but the flowers are used by lots of insects. I think it probably supports several caterpillars. And if you chop it, it will stay kind of small. Now I didn't chop mine, I let it grow 6 feet, 8 feet tall. But this is just an example that if you sit back and watch the process, the patterns and the processes are already there. I mean, they will just start to happen without even trying too hard. And so you just want to enjoy becoming part of that process. So, any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So is this different than a wildflower meadow where they say you just mow it once a year? Or are you talking about?
Yeah, interesting question. In general, I really think all these plants, you can just mow them once a year. This wasn't really an intentional meadow. It's a section in my backyard. I just drop them down in the spring. I leave them alone during the winter because habitat to me just seems the most important thing. Now, traditional meadow, most of them, once the meadow's established, they say to just mow it once a year. And some people will mow sections and leave other sections standing for like a whole cycle, so that's where the bees that might make nests in stems live, and then maybe they'll alternate, and the next year they'll mow some more. And when something's establishing the meadow thing, they will mow it more often. But I think for a smaller area in your yard, once in the spring. So I hope that answered your question.
Any other questions? Before Marlene will show us some really good ways to get your plants cheap.
Good morning, everyone. I am so excited to see such a large crowd here today. I have a couple questions for you first. First of all, raise your hand if you're a gardener. Raise your hand if you have native plants in your garden. Now raise your hand if you've ever heard of or done winter sowing. Ah, okay. Much fewer hands went up. I'm going to present to you quickly, in the interest of time, a presentation that I did with the Charles County Master Gardeners on all the dirt on winter sowing. The Charles County Master Gardeners are part of the University of Maryland Extension Service under the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. So what is winter sowing? A lot of you haven't heard of that. Winter sowing is defined by the USDA as a propagation method used throughout the winter where temperate climate seeds are sown into vented containers and placed outdoors to foster naturally timed, high percentage germination of climate-tolerant seedlings. That's a mouthful. In simpler terms, it's an incredibly easy way to grow seedlings in the middle of winter. You plant seeds in a container with a hole in the top, holes in the bottom for drainage, and wait for them to sprout. Winter sowing, as it's defined by the USDA, was coined in 2000 by an individual named Trudy Davidoff on gardenweb.org. And since introducing the method, she has moved all of her information to a Facebook group called Winter Sowers. So you may have lots of questions today during and after the presentation. I'm happy to answer them later. But this Winter Sowers group on Facebook is a wonderful resource. And Trudy basically started the method because she had lived in a small cottage in Long Island, New York, didn't have a lot of room inside to start plants, so she experimented with the method outside, putting seeds in a foil lasagna pan that she covered with holes in it, drainage holes in the bottom, and she was amazed at the germination rate. So you might ask yourself, why winter sow? For years, people have simply thrown seeds on the ground, grown seeds inside. Well, you'll find, hopefully through this presentation, winter sowing is very easy. So easy that even children can do it. It's fun. You can get your hands into soil in the middle of winter. You can't necessarily get out in your yard. It's inexpensive and environmentally friendly. Trudy based her whole concept on recycling of materials, rather than going out and buying new stuff. There are no hard and fast rules. Once you learn the basic premise of it, you adapt it to suit your own needs. It produces strong, healthy plants. One of the things that has been found is that the root systems on winter-sown plants are very healthy, and they adapt very well to going from the container into the ground. You can grow unusual plants that you can't find at a nursery. Many of you maybe have seed catalogs and buy seeds in the winter months. Well, you can definitely put your seeds into winter sowing containers and grow a lot more than what you might be able to find locally. Other reasons to winter sow: it protects the seeds themselves. So the seeds aren't going to necessarily be eaten by critters that might happen if you have them sown directly in your gardens. It eliminates the competition from weeds. How many times do you go out in the garden as things start to come up in the springtime and wonder, is that a weed or is that something I intentionally planted? It eliminates that confusion. It provides natural stratification. A lot of our plants, especially the native plants, require a period of cold, moist exposure in the wintertime. They need to go through those freezing temperatures in order for the seed coat to break down. This method provides that naturally. It eliminates the need for hardening off plants that you have to do when you grow them inside. Reduces the need for watering. Once you set up your moist environment in that enclosed container, pretty much self-waters itself. It's also exposed to the winter elements of the snow and the rain. What can you winter sow? You can winter sow almost any, or I should say any temperate climate seed. You can't winter sow tropical seeds, and you can't winter sow things like your bulbs and your corms and your tubers. It's a great process for native plants, and you'll see an example of that later in the slides. Other perennials, your herbs, your annuals, vegetables. Now that you know what it is and why you might want to do it, and you know what seeds you can do, when do you winter sow? Winter sowing happens in the winter months. That's why it's called winter sowing. Now, some people might say, well, is that from the 1st of December through the end of February? Because that's one way we define winter. Others, especially Trudy, says it's from the winter solstice until your spring equinox. So basically like December 21st to about March 21st. In the early months of the winter, you want to do your plants that require cold stratification. Again, those are your natives, some of your other perennials. Native grasses, vines, and trees, you probably want to start in the dead of winter. You can start your cold weather vegetables, like your spinach, kale, Brussels sprouts. Herbs do really well started in the middle of winter, and your hardy annuals. Just because you may have so many plants or seeds that you want to start, I typically start, like I said, with those that were on the previous slide. Once I finish those, later on, like in February, March, I move into the things like the tender annuals, the vegetables, and the herbs. But you'll find this is not a schedule that you have to abide by. Trudy would say that any plant that you put in a container in winter is smart enough to know when to awaken in the spring, because it knows that based on your day length, as your days get longer, more sunlight, and it knows it based on the temperature of the soil. So don't think your plants are going to sprout too early, because they're going to know when to come out of that dormancy. And then I save till the last part of the season, which I actually do in March, things like my warm weather crops of tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, pumpkin, squash, you name it. Anything you can grow in your vegetable garden, you can start with winter sowing. So what do you need to winter sow? The materials are pretty simple, pretty basic. You need containers. I wanted to show you a few examples of containers. You can use anything that's basically clear or translucent. This is an example of something clear. It's just a couple of beverage cups taped together, holes in the bottom, holes in the top. You want to make sure your container can accommodate at least 3 to 4 inches of soil, especially for native plants, because native plants can develop deep roots, especially if you don't plant them out just very soon in the process. Another type of container that works well, which is what this is based on, are milk jugs. Milk jugs, although they're not clear, this is considered translucent. It still lets light through. If you can hold it up to light and see your hand through it, it's the perfect container for winter sowing. Another example, this is a bleach bottle. This is opaque, light can't get through it. Doesn't mean you can't use it for winter sowing, but you might have to adapt it. Some people would cut a window in the front of it, and with that window it would let in light, so you could use it. Some people would take the whole top off, use the bottom and cover it like with a piece of plastic, like saran wrap or a baggie with holes in it. That'll work too. But you'll see there are lots of options for containers, and I have a whole box over on the table that you're welcome to come look at during a break. You need potting mix. The important thing about potting mix is that it's basically you use a potting mix or a seed starting mix. You don't want to use soil out of your garden. It's too dense and it won't drain well. So my preference is a potting mix that I can get from the Amish here locally. It's a large bale of dry mix that I get lots of containers out of. It has a starter fertilizer in it, so that I don't have to worry about getting my seeds out of the containers once they germinate. Seeds in themselves have the nutrients they need to sprout and to get to that first set of true leaves. They don't have enough nutrients to get them beyond that. So once your seeds germinate, it's good if your potting mix has some sort of starter fertilizer in it, or if you think about putting a dilute fertilizer on them. The classic way for winter sowing, you need tape to seal it and to label it. You need a marker for labeling. If you're going to mark on the outside of the containers, you need something that's UV resistant. I've started using a grease pencil. I find that that works easily. Trudy's tried and true way is to use a permanent marker on a piece of duct tape and put it on the bottom of the jug, but that's kind of difficult if you plant lots of jugs to pick them up and look and see what's in there. So a lot of folks label the containers themselves on the outside. You need scissors or a sharp knife to prepare your containers. Of course, you need your seeds and water, and you need a lot of patience while you wait for the seeds to germinate. You may also find it helpful to have a bucket or container to mix your medium and your water. Plant tags for inside the jugs. I do also put a label inside my jugs in case the outside labeling fails. I put a coffee filter in the bottom of my jugs because I do have a problem with slugs. The coffee filter will keep the soil in and keep the slugs out, but it's not mandatory. And a lot of the soils we recommend that you use gloves when you're handling the soil, trowel to put your soil in the jugs, and then I use a drill for putting the holes in my containers, but I have to confess, I don't do the drill, my husband does it for me. I've converted my husband to being a winter sower. So we've broken the process into 10 simple steps, and I'll actually pass some of these around so you can see them as I'm talking. And again, there are no hard and fast rules, but this is just so when we did our presentation, we kind of stayed on track with what we were talking about. You can kind of look at those while I'm talking. First, you want to collect and wash your containers. There's nothing special. Rinsing them, maybe with a little soap and water. They don't have to be bleached. It's not important that these things be sterile-like when you start plants inside. You want to cut drain holes in the bottom. Again, I use a drill for that. You can also just use a sharp knife. Some people use like a soldering iron or a wood burning tool. Additional container prep. If you're going to use something that is not translucent or transparent, you might want to create a window for the sun. This is a butter tub that light can't get through, but if you cut a hole in the top and leave enough material around the rim, you can put that lid back on with a piece of saran wrap or other plastic, and then you can use this. This will be fine for winter sowing. Perfect depth, you let light in. You want to prepare your labels. I can't stress that enough. You'll probably hear me say that more than one time. Add the potting mix and water thoroughly. Plant your seeds, seal the container, and then we'll talk about care of your jugs, opening in the spring on warm days, and transplanting. Again, I've pretty much talked about the containers. Use your imagination. If it can receive light, and if you can put the holes in it for the winter elements to get in and the water to get out, it's fine. Again, cut the drain holes in the bottom. I already talked about the additional container prep if you have something that doesn't let the light in. Labels, again, I can't stress it enough. Trudy recommends you label the bottom of the jug. I put a plant tag inside my jug, and then if you're going to label the outside of the jug, please use something that's not going to wear off. A permanent marker will wear off. So I recommend a grease pencil. Some people use nail polish, paint pens, lots of options. You want to add your potting mix and wet thoroughly. I always mix my dry mix in a bucket or some sort of tub before I put it in the container, make sure it's nice and moist. Add, like I said, 3 to 4 inches of potting mix. If you're planting native plants or perennials, you definitely need that depth. You want to make sure you tap the container or tamp on the soil to settle it, and make sure you water it and that water's draining out the bottom. This is my colleague Molly. She and I did this presentation together. This is her setup. She actually likes to combine her 4 pots of the potting medium with a part of vermiculite. Putting your seeds in, it's recommended that you only do 1 type of seed at a time. I may mix 2 varieties of tomatoes just because I don't need a whole like milk jug full of tomato plants, so I may do half of it with one variety and half with another. But stick with similar varieties. They're going to sprout at the same time and hopefully grow to the same height. Again, mark your containers. For really tiny seeds, you can just sprinkle them on the soil. I just sprinkle with my fingers. Some people prefer that they mix with sand to kind of cut the amount of seeds that they would be putting in once they sprinkle the sand. Again, like anything else in winter sowing, it's a personal choice. For larger seeds, you may want to follow the instructions on the packet for the planting depth, especially, depending on the size of the seeds. The larger the seed, the deeper it probably needs to be. Information on planting depth can be found on seed packets if you order seeds. You can go to online resources. A popular one for winter sowers is Prairie Moon. That not only gives you things like planting depth, but it also talks about cold stratification if you have native seeds and you're not sure if they need, how much time they need in the soil. And the timing on the seed packets, that's pretty much for your indoor germination, so don't worry about the timing on the seed packets. That's one thing you can ignore. And this is an example just of showing the one on the right shows where seeds were just sprinkled on, so you get a heavy, dense mat. And on the left, it shows where they were individually spaced. If they're individually spaced, you can easily take, plant by plant out and pop it in your garden. When they're in mass, like the ones on the right, it's recommended that you maybe cut them brownie style, like take the whole soil clump out of the container, take a really sharp knife, cut it into smaller sections, and then plant those sections in the ground. It doesn't matter if you plant a lot of them together. Mother Nature knows best, and the strongest will survive. So it's a matter of preference how you put your seeds in the container. And then you seal your containers with tape. Some people just bring the lid of the milk jug back down, and some of them tie it like with pipe cleaners. They put holes in the top and holes in the bottom and tie it with pipe cleaners. I found an easy way where if I put a slit in the top section, it will rest down into the bottom, and I don't even really need to tape it, except maybe putting 1 piece of tape on the front to keep it secure. See if I can get that done. Something like that. The top will nest into the bottom, and you can just put a single piece of tape. And then once you seal them, you want to put them in outside where they're exposed to the elements. You don't want them under the eave of a house. You want to make sure they're somewhere where they'll get the rain and the snow. It really doesn't matter if it's sun or shade. Some people put them on the northern side of the house in the shade. Some people put them in the sun. It's personal preference. Again, the length of the day, even if it's in the shade of the front of the house, daylight is getting longer, and the seeds will recognize that. And the soil will warm up wherever it's put. So again, those are some of the critical things. As long as they're moist enough, the length of the day and the temperature of the soil is going to determine when they germinate. You can't hurry the seeds. This isn't a way to start plants early. So don't think you're going to get a jump start on your garden. It's not a way to jump start. It's just a way to germinate plants at a higher rate without losing them to the other things like your squirrels and your gophers and other things that are tending to get your seeds in the ground. Let's see. If you're using the milk jugs or anything else that has a cap, don't put the cap on it. Again, you need those jugs to be able to ventilate because they will get hot as the temperatures warm up in the springtime, and you want the air to come out. You also want the snow and the rain to get in. You want to place them in a protected area so that they don't get knocked over. Again, sun or part shade, doesn't matter. What you do want to do is monitor the dampness. You'll notice when you plant your container, you'll get used to the weight of the jug when the soil is damp. If you find that there's no condensation in your jug, which it will develop condensation as it heats up, if you find there's no condensation or the weight of it starts to get really light, then you want to consider watering your jugs. You could set them in a pan of water and bottom water them, because the soil will act like a sponge and soak it up, or you can use a mister or something to put water in through the top of the jug. If it becomes too damp and you see that a green tinge is forming on the top of the soil, you may want to open it, because it could be that it's too moist and it's allowing algae to grow. It won't hurt your plants. Some people just think it's unsightly, so you may want to just open them and let it breathe for a little bit and then close them back up. You could also put more vent holes in the top. Once your seeds germinate, what do? Well, once they develop 1 to 2 sets of true leaves, the first set of leaves are not the true leaves. A lot of plants look the same when their first sets of leaves come out. Once they develop true leaves and they look like the plant that you're expecting, you can open them up, and anytime after that, consider putting them in your garden. If there's an unexpected warm cell after they germinate, you definitely want to make sure you open them up and remove them to shade, because that heat can kill your seedlings very quickly. I don't move mine. Mine were fine all last year in the spots I chose, and I put mine in I guess it gets part sun, part shade on the southern side of my house, and they did fine. If there's an unexpected cold spell after germination, some people feel that because the seeds have sprouted, those little seedlings are going to be prone to maybe freezing if we get a frost, but they're in that protected environment, sort of like a cloche in a garden. They're not going to freeze as quickly as something that's not covered, but some folks, once they see green, they think they should cover it with blankets or sheets or something to give it that extra protection. It's really not necessary. If those seeds know it was time to sprout, then their foliage is probably strong enough to withstand a night of frost or freezing temps here and there. This is one of Molly's pictures of some of her natives that had germinated, and when she opened the container, she was surprised to find a little frog inside. I don't know if you can see that. So don't be surprised. Things can get into your containers. It's part of nature. So now it's time to transplant your seedlings. I've already said you can transplant them when there are at least 2 sets of true leaves. Some people like to let them grow in the containers longer. That's fine too. You just may need to fertilize them. You want to open the containers for a couple days to allow them to acclimate. That's more because you want to expose, and maybe put them in the area where you're going to plant them. That exposes them to the sunlight that they're going to be in and to the winds, because they've been protected from the wind all this time. You can pull the individual plants apart gently. The roots are fragile, but they're not as fragile as plants grown inside, so don't feel like you have to be real careful with them. Use a sharp knife or hunk of seedlings if you want to plant them brownie style. And you want to water them thoroughly, just like any transplant. In fact, it's easier if you water them before you take them out of the container and let them drain. It makes the soil easier to work with, and then water them really well once you put them in the ground.
Could you repeat that part from our previous slide about what happens if you get a cold snap after?
So if you get a cold snap, your seedlings knew it was time for them to germinate, and now you've got this green growth. Some people think that because they've got the growth, that growth might be susceptible to freezing or frost. But if they've germinated like now, in this type of weather, you're only going to have things like your hardy perennials or your annuals, hardy annuals germinating, and or your cold season vegetables. Like I've been winter sowing since January 1st, and the only thing that is sprouted now are my cold crops like lettuce, arugula, spinach, that I maybe put in the beginning of February. So they know nothing else has germinated. A few natives have germinated, but they all know when the time is right. So their foliage, the foliage of like your cool weather crops and your natives, are more accustomed to these cooler temps.
Thank you.
I'm not going to dwell on this story about tomatoes, although it's my pride and joy from last year, but this is a native plant shop, so I'm going to go through that. But this presentation is on the Charles County Master Gardener website. So if you look under, do a Google search for Charles County Master Gardeners and go under our resource page, it's under our Master Gardener videos. You'll find both a recorded presentation that my colleague and I did back in November, and you'll also find the slide deck there. But this is Molly's, these are Molly's pictures. Molly winter sowed for wildlife, for the native plants. And she had an exceptional crop of cardinal flower, and when Molly did the math, she figured she got more than 60 plants, which if they were estimated to be $6.50, say, a quart at a native plant nursery, she would have spent $390, and she spent $3 on a package of seeds. So you can see it's a very economical way to start native plants. It's not to take away from any of the other ways you can get native plants, whether it be the plugs, or whether you get them from Division from Friends, or you go to the nurseries and get the quarts and the gallons. Again, it's like everything else with gardening. It's personal choice, the economics of things for some of us. So once I found my joy of native plants, which I was introduced to from Master Gardener plant sales and from fellow Master Gardeners who gifted me with plants. And then I found plugs at Butterfly Alley. Then my next thing was I found this Winter Sowers Facebook group last year. I attended Butterfly Alley's seed swap in the fall, and then their winter sowing thing in the fall, which I have hundreds now of native plant varieties that I'm trying to grow through winter sowing. And it's becoming quite successful. Our presentation has all the resources that we used when we put it together. We used a lot of information from Trudy's Winter Sowers Facebook group. There was also a very good winter sowing presentation done by another extension service. That was by Dolly Foster. So if you look on YouTube for anything from Dolly Foster, she has since done a more recent winter sowing presentation. These were other references we used. The graphic that we used for the 10 steps and that I passed around, that was used courtesy of Skycrest Studios. Always want to put out the plug for the people who are providing the information. And the photos used in the presentation were courtesy of Molly and I. And you'll hear not only from us, but from the other Master Gardener presenters, lots of information on the University of Maryland Extension resource page. Feel free to go there for information. And the Master Gardeners, we have 6 basic programs under us: our plant clinics, Grow It, Eat It programs, Baywise, pollinators, composting, and again here when everybody was here for the native plants. And again, brought to you by Charles County Master Gardeners. Caitlin Bellagush is our Charles County coordinator, and she's here today. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And with that, I'd like to see a show of hands of who may try winter sowing now that they've seen this presentation. All right, I got the word across. That's what I'm happy about. Now, in the interest of time, I couldn't stand here and do a demo in the time we were allotted and with the crowd that we have. But I have supplies here for a limited number of individuals. If you'd like to sow something to take home with you today, we have the materials for the containers, the soil. We have some select native plant seeds. So I will be around during lunch and breaks. If anybody wants to stay afterwards, by all means, we'd like to get some more native seeds in containers and in the ground.
Question. The resulting seedlings, are they more hardy than if you started it with a seed tray and a mat?
Yes, so what you'll find, you don't have the expense of all those indoor things like your racks, your lights, your mats, your seed trays. The things you don't have also, you don't have the problems with damping off that occasionally happens with plants that are seeded inside, and you don't have to worry about hardening them off. They do have stronger roots. What I have seen, and other master gardeners can attest to, is that your winter sown seedling, it's not going to give you a jump on gardening, so don't think about that. It's going to give you the stronger plants. So I have seen winter sown seedlings like this go into a Grow It, Eat It garden next to a hothouse tomato that look like this, with a tomato on it, and those winter sown seedlings, after a few weeks in the ground, far surpassed that greenhouse plant and grew huge. If you look at the pictures in this presentation for the tomatoes, my husband's 6'3", and they were taller than him. We were staking them, we were doing a Florida weave on bamboo stakes, and they just outgrew the stakes, and we had to top them off. Very hardy plants. Yes, ma'am?
Can you say again, so it's the third week in February, what can I still try this year in terms of vegetables?
Okay, so you have a whole month left of winter. Okay, we have a whole, you can do anything vegetable-wise. I don't know of any vegetable that needs cold stratification. The timing is more for your plants that need that cold stratification, if you're familiar with that. So if you have a native plant that requires 90 days cold stratification, you want that sown in December or January. Because if you sow that now, it's not going to get the cold treatment it needs. So that's the only reason we present a schedule, not to say you have to go by this. But there's also spring sowing and summer sowing. It's called winter sowing because you do it during those 3 months of winter, but you can still sow in containers in the spring and in the summer, and on Trudy's website, she talks about all those things. Lots of great information there. Yes, ma'am?
I've had seeds in my refrigerator, the native seeds, so if I plant them out, they are considered stratified.
Right. If you've done your treatment of stratification in the refrigerator, you could put them in containers and they should grow fine. Yeah. Any other questions? I mean, again, we'll be around for the rest of the afternoon. We're not going anywhere. So anybody who'd like to maybe try their hand at it or just take some seeds with you, feel free. Thank you.